Hello, everybody. I have here today Chapter 15 of Book 2 of the Royal Rangers series, The Red Fox Clan. Let's go ahead and get into it. For a few seconds, Maddie was tempted to throw off her bedclothes and hurry to the lower cellar. Then, she reconsidered. It was cold. It would be colder still below ground level, and it would be dark and difficult to see anything. Furthermore, if she went exploring down there now, she was liable to disturb the night watch and cause an alarm. Questions would be asked about what she was doing, and she preferred not to have to answer them. She pulled the blankets back round her chin. "It'll still be there tomorrow," she said, yawning, and settled back under the blankets. She ate breakfast hurriedly the next morning. There were only a few others in the buttery, members of the castle staff who were either coming on or going off duty. She was grateful there was nobody there with whom she needed to talk. Her head was too full of the possibilities in the lower cellar, and she would have been a poor conversationalist. Her mother was a habitual early riser, she knew, but she was probably having her breakfast in her room or in her office. Maddie didn't quite understand why she was so intent on not discussing the possible existence of a secret tunnel or a concealed stairway with anyone. Maybe it was because she felt that the tunnels and stairways, if they were there, had been kept secret for a reason. Even Uldred's attitude seemed to indicate that he didn't really believe they existed, that they were more the subject of myth. Or perhaps it was her training as a ranger that made her reluctant to discuss the matter. Rangers were notoriously secretive and close-mouthed. They liked to possess knowledge that others didn't, to be aware of matters that others weren't. You never knew, after all, when such knowledge might give you an advantage. From habit born at the little cabin in Redmont Fief, she took her dishes to the kitchen, rinsed them in the big sink, and stacked them to be washed. The scullery maid looked at her in surprise. She wasn't used to members of the nobility doing menial work. "Thank you, my lady," she said, but Maddie barely heard her, her mind intent on what she was about to do. She found a lantern in a store cupboard, ascertained that the reservoir was full of oil, and headed for the stairs down to the cellar. She checked that she had her sacks in a scabbard, and her sling rolled up and tucked beneath her belt. A pouch of shot for the sling weighed heavily on her left hip. She didn't think she'd need weapons, but you never knew. Once again, there was nobody in the upper cellar, and she was glad to see it. The housekeeping staff had renewed the torches and lanterns and gone on to their next task. The same held true for the lower cellar. She walked up to one of the torches, set in a bracket on the wall. She had noticed the previous day that a supply of wax tapers was kept close to hand, presumably for lighting the central lamps. She raised the glass in her own lantern now, wound the wick up a centimeter or so, and lit a taper from the torch, carrying the tiny flame to the wick. Soaked with oil from the reservoir, it flared up immediately in a bright yellow flame, tinged with black smoke at the top. She lowered the wick so that it was burning more cleanly, and the black smoke disappeared. Then she closed the glass front of the lantern. The light, reflected from the polished metal disc behind the wick, shone out strongly, throwing a pool of light ahead of her. She took the lantern and moved to the end wall, crouching to look at the words scratched into the stone there. "Sinister, sinister, sinister. Left, left, left," she muttered to herself. Or 3 left. Or left 3. She tried variations to see if they made more sense. Left 3, she decided, after a moment's thought. She placed her hand on the inscribed stone, then counted 3 stones to the left, touching each with her forefinger. There was absolutely nothing remarkable about the stone she was now touching. It was identical in every way with its neighbors. She pushed it experimentally, placing the flat of her hand in the middle of its rough surface. Nothing. She tried pushing on the edge of the stone, searching for any slight movement there. In keeping with the instructions so far, She pressed the left-hand side first, then the right. Again, nothing. She tried pushing the top and bottom, with no result. Then she wedged her fingers in the shallow gap between the stone and the next in line, and tried pulling the top, then the bottom. Nothing budged. She sat back on her haunches, thinking. As she often did in such a situation, she spoke her thoughts aloud. Left, 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 she said softly. What else can it mean? Of course, she realized. It could mean any stone in the row that was third from the corner. She let her gaze run up the row, seeking any sign of a crack or a fault in the mortar. But there was nothing. She'd try the others in that row in a minute. But for now, there was another possible interpretation. Maybe it means 3 left from the first stone, not the corner itself, she said. That would make it the 4th stone in the row. She moved her attention 1 more stone to the left, bringing the lantern close to study the seams, the mortar, and the stone itself. She pushed on the middle of the stone. Nothing happened. Solid as a rock, she murmured. She was going through the motions now, dispirited and more than half convinced that she had misinterpreted the meaning of the 3 words gouged into the rock. She pressed half-heartedly against the left-hand side of the stone. There was a resounding metallic clack from inside the wall, and a section 3 stones wide, with the keystone in the center, swung smoothly out from the wall, traveling a distance of 1/2 meter before stopping. She inserted her fingers in the wide gap at the left-hand edge and heaved. The door, 1.5 meters high by a meter wide, swung easily, pivoting on a central hinge and revealing a dark cavity behind it. She rose to a crouch and, holding out the lantern so it began to illuminate the dark space behind the door, peered in round the edge that now stood out from the wall. She could see stone walls inside, in a space about 3 meters by 3 meters. Gingerly, she turned sideways and squeezed through the opening, holding the lantern up to let its light fill the space and dispel the shadows. The walls were rough-hewn stone, not dressed and trimmed like the outside. The ceiling was more roughly worked rock, and there was barely room for her to stand erect under it. The small room was littered with cobwebs. The floor was dirt, dry clay, she thought, studying it more closely. It was rough and uneven underfoot as she moved a few paces into the cavity. The wall behind her, through which she just passed, was to the north. In each of the 3 walls that faced her, she could see the dark outline of an entrance, or an exit. 1 east, 1 west, 1 south. She went to the western exit and held the lamp inside at arm's length. There was a narrow tunnel there, barely a meter wide, leading off in a straight line and descending gradually downhill. She frowned, orienting herself. The moat lay in that direction, she realized. The moat and the outer walls. She felt a surge of excitement, and her breath came faster as her heart rate accelerated. Duncan said that his ancestor had used a tunnel to pass in and out of the castle without anyone seeing him. Could this be that tunnel? Holding the lantern high, she took a step into the tunnel. Tiny feet skittered and pattered somewhere in the darkness. Rats, she thought. Their presence didn't bother her unduly. She had a sax and a lantern, and chances were they'd stay away from the light. She took another pace, then hesitated, realizing she'd left the concealed door wide open behind her. If anyone came down to the cellar, they'd see it, and the secret would be out. She retraced her steps hurriedly, and pushed against the inner edge of the door so that it pivoted shut with that same loud clack. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, she said doubtfully. She went down on her knees and felt along the bottom row until she reached the 4th stone from the left. To enter, she had pushed against the left side, which now would be on the right. She placed her hand on the right side now and pushed again. Clack! The doors swung open again, and she breathed a sigh of relief. The thought of being trapped in here was not a pleasant one. Now she knew she would be able to get back out the way she had come in, and the sense of foreboding that had been growing in her chest was eased. "Nothing to it, really," she said, mocking herself. "Then let's see where this tunnel goes," she replied. She closed the door once more. Holding the lantern up, she stepped carefully into the dark tunnel, her feet slipping on the uneven clay beneath them. A tangle of cobwebs brushed her face, and she shoved them aside impatiently. As she moved farther into the tunnel, she felt it sloping sharply beneath her feet. Again, she heard the skitter of paws and claws on the rock and clay, but she saw nothing. "They're more afraid of you than you are of them," she said. Then she replied, "Are you afraid of them?" This time, she didn't answer. She preferred not to lie to herself. She went on, stepping carefully as she felt the ground become softer underfoot. She held the lantern low and studied the tunnel floor. The clay was wet here, as water forced its way through the roof and walls and dripped down. Her shoulder brushed the wall. There really wasn't a lot of room down here, and left a smear of wet clay on her jerkin. The air was chill and smelled of damp. More water dripped from the ceiling, and she pulled her collar up to shield herself from it. "I must be under the moat," she said, with some wonder in her tone. She tried to remember how wide the moat was. She seemed to recall it was 8 to 10 meters across, and she shuffled on, placing her feet carefully and counting her steps. The floor of the tunnel was level now. It was no longer sloping down. Then it began to slope up once more, and the dripping water gradually tapered off. Something was hanging from the ceiling of the tunnel, and she brought her lantern up to study it more carefully. It was a dense tangle of roots. She recognized it as the root ball of a sizable bush. "I'm outside the walls," she said. She looked along the length of the tunnel ahead of her, where the darkness swallowed the dim light of her lantern, and wondered how far it went. "Only one way to find out," she said, and set out into the dark tunnel. All right, that will be the conclusion of Chapter 15. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you guys next time in Chapter 16. God bless, and have a good one.